Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Everyday Theologian podcast. Today's topic is going to be on the problem of theodicy. But before I dive into that topic, I just wanted to highlight a quick thanks to At Truth and Life for his comments on the last podcast on Calvinism and Arminianism. My hope is that others will continue to comment as these podcasts get released and that we can have good conversations or surrounding some of these topics that we are going to be exploring. I also want to just quickly mention the book on Calvinism that I mentioned in the last podcast, which is called The 5 Points of Calvinism, and it's written by Edwin H. Palmer. So if Calvinism is still a topic that is of interest to you and you want to learn a little bit more about it, I definitely recommend checking that book out. It's really easy to read, really short, and yet a very good introduction to what Calvinism is about. Okay, everybody, let's just jump right into the topic at hand for today on the problem of theodicy. For this topic, I'm going to be using Peter Kreeft's book, Making Sense Out of Suffering. I found this an incredibly great framework for discussing the problem of evil. In it, on page 28, he discusses how the problem of evil is created by an inconsistency among four propositions. And the four propositions he gives is that God exists, God is all powerful, God is all good, and that evil exists. Now, for Kreeft, if any one of these things, any one of these four propositions is not true, then we are left with the problem of suffering in this world, the problem of theodicy. And if any one of these, again, does not exist or is not true, it's, as the book suggests, almost impossible to make sense out of why we suffer. If you guys have any thoughts again on this particular subject, because what I'm going to be going into today is pretty narrowed on Kreeft, please leave a comment below, and I would love to just dialogue with you on a particular problem that you might have, given on this topic of suffering. If you're comfortable with it and you want to share a personal story of something maybe you've gone through, I would love to hear what you've been through and how your faith has been challenged maybe through that particular circumstance. But that again is only if you're comfortable sharing that. But please, by all means, this is the kind of stuff I want to be talking about on this podcast. So to get back to Kreeft, he gives those four propositions, which are God exists, God is all powerful, God is all good, and evil exists. And he then gives 10 common answers or traditional answers that have been used to try to solve this problem of suffering that we all have dealt with. And so real quickly on his framework, you got the four propositions and then the 10 potential suggestive answers to the problem of evil based on those four propositions. And Kreeft groups these 10 answers that are commonly given in a way that corresponds to those four propositions. So, for example, the first three he categorizes as the denial of God's reality, which denies the first proposition that God exists. And then the second group of three he categorizes as denials of God's power, which is falsifying the second proposition that God is all powerful. And then the third group is of his points, 7, 8, and 9, are an attack against the third proposition that God is all good, and he lists that as denials of God's goodness. And then finally, his 10th point, he categorizes as a denial of evil, which obviously is against the fourth proposition that evil. So in his first category, which he classifies as denials of God's reality, which is against his first proposition that God exists, is a common answer, which is atheism. So some people's response to suffering is simply that there is no God. A second way of denying God's reality is to demythologize him. So he calls this demythologism. So that's a very hard word. You can't really say it fast. This is why theology exists, just to say fancy words. But in a nutshell, demythologism is the fairy tale God. So it's this belief that everything in the Bible and the stories about God is not actually true. It's just a very nice story. And then the third denial of God's existence is what he calls psychologism. Psychologism, as he describes, is the subjective God. It's the God of our minds. It's the God we conjecturize in our minds. We conjure up, is what I'm trying to say. Tried to make a word there. It didn't really work. But it's really just a therapeutic God, basically. Then finally, his second category is the denials of God's power. And he, on his fourth point, lists the old paganism answer, which is polytheism, the belief in many gods. So if God is just one God among many other gods, he's always vying for power. This is what the Greeks and Romans believed, and that's why it's an ancient paganism belief. But traditionally, this has been one way of, I guess, believing in an idea of God, but not necessarily the real God of the scriptures. And if God is just one among many, then he isn't ultimately in control, and that becomes a problem because it's against the second proposition that God is all powerful. So God can actually help us in our suffering. His fifth point is what he calls the new scientific paganism, or the naturalistic God. Now, this is more of a God that we are familiar with in our time, not so much like the point four of the polytheism, although that still exists today. But that was a lot more common, at least from a cultural standpoint, in the ancient Roman times and Greek times. In today's modern times, or what people call modernity, we are more into an era of science and technology now. So this naturalistic God that Kreeft describes is one that science has to prove. If science can't prove it, then it doesn't exist. So then it reduces God down to what science can prove, and ultimately, God is powerless to be above the natural order, and if God is all natural, then he's also subjected to the process of death, and he is not anything that the Bible claims him to be. And so we are left with a God less than the God of the scriptures, and one that isn't ultimately in control or powerful, or who conquered the grave and all that kind of stuff. So it goes against his fourth proposition that God is all powerful. His sixth point is what he calls dualism. This is obviously a common term in theology. It's a belief in two gods. And so this is problematic because some people have tried to answer the problem of evil by stating that God is just one of two main forces in this world, that between good and evil. So there's a God, and then there's this devil figure, and both of them are at war with each other, and neither of them have complete control over the other, and uh, no one is in complete control, and the outcome remains to be seen. So either one of them have equal opportunity to beat the other. So clearly, that's a denial of God's omnipotence, his all-powerfulness, and that would leave us with a God who is unable to deliver us from evil and from the sufferings that we experience in this world. Now, his third category in the denials of God's goodness, his third proposition, we have this, what he calls Satanism, the worship of a bad God. So this goes beyond just dualism, that God and the devil are at war, but this belief that ultimately what we see in this world is evil, and the person responsible for that is Satan, and he seems to be winning the war, and so there are people that worship this God. His eighth point was pantheism, and he calls this the belief in a blob God. So pantheism is this belief that God is a part of his creation, his spirit. This is kind of an ancient belief again as well. But it's this belief that God's spirit is in everything he's created. It's in everything that this created order it shows or reveals. And how Kreeft uses this idea of pantheism then is to say that God is God's spirit, and his involvement is basically behind every evil act as well. So every evil act that happened, God is present in. He is there. He is the one who does both. And so clearly that's problematic as well if God is all good. So it denies his third proposition if God is behind everything that happens that is evil as well. Now, deism is the opposite of pantheism. It's a belief that God is distant from the world. It's often referred to by theologians as the clockmaker God, the God who created the watch and then got all its mechanisms going and then pulled back. And now the watch just functions on its own. That metaphor applies to deism and the deistic God, then, who is the God who started creation and then pulled back and left it completely alone. And so Kreeft calls the deistic God the snob God, in that he is this withdrawn figure from the world. So this is problematic to God's goodness, his third proposition, obviously, because if God created everything and then just left it to suffer on its own, we are left with an apathetic God at best, one who doesn't care, one who does not love his creation, and one who certainly does nothing to help his creation. Now, clearly, Christ, Jesus Christ, the incarnation, it just totally flies in the face of deism, right? It's a God that comes down and enters our world. It's not a God who is distant. So deism is just not something that Christians have ever believed in, and is considered a heresy within Christianity. It's something outside the bounds of what we believe. And then finally, his 10th point is against his fourth proposition, and that's to deny that evil actually exists. He categorizes that as the denial of evil. And so he calls his 10th point idealism. And idealism is just, yeah, it's a failure to believe that evil exists. It's about putting a positive spin on everything. It's being moralistic and seeing the good in everything. And this is a denial that evil exists. So in a nutshell, that's Kreeft, his four propositions and his the 10 common responses to those four propositions. And as I said before, those first 9, which are 3 groups of 3, deny the first 3 propositions, and the last one of idealism denies flat out that evil even exists. And if none of these, according to Kreeft, none of these 4 propositions, if any of them, I should say, are denied, and not all 4 of them together don't exist as true, and if even one of them is found to be false, then we are left with the problem of theodicy. So I hope that helps. This is just using Kreeft and his book, Making Sense of Suffering, to lay a framework for the problem of theodicy, the problem of suffering that we experience in this world. It's only one way in which to tackle this problem. There are many other ways. Obviously, C.S. Lewis and the problem of pain, for example, is another way of trying to answer this problem. The free will defense is another way, and that's something I'm sure Lewis would be a proponent of. This idea that we all have free will and that maybe we're the cause of suffering in the world, humanity is. And so there are a lot of different streams into this conversation, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts and comment. So please comment below of maybe something that has really helped you in this topic of how to make sense out of suffering. And I'd be glad to hear your thoughts, and it might be something obviously that I can benefit from. So please leave your thoughts, and thanks for listening today, and wanted to keep this one a little bit shorter. And we'll look to have another theological topic for another day. Thanks again. We'll talk to you later.